welcome to everybody, and thank you so much for enabling us to have this forum on tonight. We were reflecting back, and it's 2019, the last time we were able to actually do a forum here with COVID happening. So we're really happy that we're able to do this, and we've got a great lineup of speakers. But I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're on and the Kaurna Nation, the people, and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. So I just thought I'd give you a quick update on what we're doing with Neuroendocrine Cancer Australia. And I'm Meredith Cummins. I took over as CEO in October last year. And I just wanted to acknowledge also that we've got at the back there Simone in her emerald green cardigan. And we've got Crystal up the back as well, and Joyce. So that's our net nurses that we have for the whole of the organisation, and we are a small organisation, and I think we do pretty well for everything that we do. So, but we're always very willing to take advice on what you need, where the gaps are, and to move forward. So, I guess we need to go that way, don't we? So I thought, what are we up to? I just thought I'd do a brief overview of neuroendocrine cancer and the stats and things that are available at the moment. So these stats that are here are ones that are from 2022 from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. So the incidence is around about 5,437 cases, new cases each year. And as you can see on the graph there, that it's a lot more than testicular cervical multiple myeloma and Hodgkin's lymphoma. The 5-year survival rate for NET patients is currently at 51%, which is compared to the survival rate of breast cancer, which is 95%. And NETs affects men and women equally as far as age goes. Just some fine-tuning of some of the stats as well. We've got 30% of patients live 300 kilometres or more away from their closest centre of excellence. 1 in 55 patients, Australians, are likely to get the neuroendocrine cancer. 30% of patients are diagnosed in the emergency department, which people find sort of quite astounding that stat is, but I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that they've been misdiagnosed and they've gone to their GP, they've had nothing sort of happening, they've ended up with a lot of pain, they've gone to the hospital and they've been picked up there. Or the other possibility is that they're presenting with appendicitis and that they actually then find out that they have to have their appendix removed and the appendix has got NET in it. So that's some of the background of the 30%. There's over 24,000 NETs living with NETs living in Australia currently, and the patients have a 51%, as I've said before, and there's 1 Australian is diagnosed with neuroendocrine tumour every 2 hours in Australia. The average Australian waits 5 years for having had a misdiagnosis previously. And then I think the other stat that is really sort of significant is there's 60% chance that they've got stage 4 disease because of the late diagnosis. And stage 4 is where it's spread to the liver or other organs. So just to let you know about Neuroendocrine Cancer Australia, our vision is to be champions of early diagnosis and a cure, and our mission is to assist and support patients and carers through support groups and access to networks of expertise. And we frequently lobby for access to new and appropriate investigations and treatments, and we're very busy lobbying with the MPs at the moment to try and get more funding. And also we've recently been in talking to the MPs, we're getting communication through, we've had patients who have approached their MPs, they've got letters back from the MPs and said that neuroendocrine cancer research has been awarded $73 million over the last 10 years for research. And we thought, that doesn't sound right. And we're doing a bit of investigation, and luckily somebody sort of gave us some really good statistics. We found out it's actually only $8 million over the last 10 years that's been given to neuroendocrine cancer research. The other 60 odd million went to neurological cancers. So the people who were providing the statistics didn't understand the difference between neuroendocrine and neurological. Also, one of our missions is to raise awareness and knowledge with the medical community and general public, and we're about to launch a national awareness campaign with the money that we did get from the government, so we're very excited about that. And we also encourage and support research in the area of neuroendocrine cancers, which is the Planet Registry, which we're slowly getting underway. COVID really sort of slowed it down as far as recruitment, but we're hoping that we can sort of pick up again. And I know Queen Elizabeth is very active with trying to get everything mapped as far as all the data that goes in, and also getting the patients onto the registry. There's the AusNet nurse-led shared care model, of which we've got Matt and Chad, who are from Flinders University, and Neuroendocrine Cancer Australia, and Jess, and 4 other sites around Australia are going to be part of that. So it's a really exciting study that we're going to do, which is looking at when the cases are spoken about at the multidisciplinary team, then our net nurse and the local net nurse will be together, talk to the patient about the management plan, and then we'll have a case conference with the GP so that everybody is kept in the loop and knows what's going on with the patient. So we also have the patient support. We have the net nurse support line, and we're getting about 180 contacts a month, give or take a bit, but it's been increasing by about 25% each year. We've got resources including 2 explainer videos, and we've got a couple more in development, and the 2 explainer videos we're actually just translating into Arabic and Mandarin so that we've got a bit more access to culturally diverse communities. Support groups across Australia, of which Jess is an amazing facilitator with face-to-face group, and there's also a national Zoom meeting which is held monthly, which Joyce does those. Private Facebook discussion group is over 1,700 active members, and NEPA remains the main referral service for NET patients around the country. So just with education, we have put together modules which are fully accredited with RACGP. So if your GP hasn't done the modules, get onto them. It's very comprehensive and it is fully accredited, so they can get points for that. It's online and it's free, and they can do it in their own time. And we also had it accredited for nurses as well, so that they can actually get CPD or their continuing professional development points. We've had over 2,500 healthcare professionals, which GPs and nurses do it up until the beginning of the year, and I think we've had about another 300 since we had it re-accredited. As I said, we've had a funding one-off for the National Awareness Campaign. We do in-services online to hospitals and GPs so that they don't have to go anywhere. We can go to them by doing Zoom, and they're all free. And we also have the NET Patient Education Program, which is Living with NETs, which we're now doing 3 times a year. And that's 2 hours over 4 weeks. And we go through everything that's to do with neuroendocrine tumours, navigating the system, exercise, diet, financial issues, just covering every spectrum that we possibly can. And it's a good opportunity. We normally have about 12 who are on the course. So it's a good opportunity for patients, old and new, to share experiences together and just be able to feel comfortable to help each other. And it's not just all of us doing medical information, it's actually sort of enabling people to live a life that they're able to do as fully as possible. So I'll just click past that. We also do advocacy. So we have the National Action Plan, which we launched in 2021, and we've got 8 actions, of which we've got a one-off for the information and resource and the National Awareness Campaign. We've actually done the Optimal Care Pathway now, and that was launched on the 30th of January. So within having the Optimal Care Pathway, it's a very comprehensive document, but there is also a quick reference guide for GPs. So it's a 4-page document that they can actually go through. And if they're suspecting a NET, that they can see what are the appropriate tests and everything to do, and the referral pathway, so that we can streamline the time and the workup beforehand. And we've also got, with the Optimal Care Pathway, there's a patient best cancer guide for patients as well. And I just thought I'd update, I'm not sure how many of you are on somatostatin analogues within the room, But just to let you know that the eShine program closed on the 30th of April. They did do a lot of letters and everything out to healthcare professionals and patients, and so that's no longer available as a home nursing injection. So what they're trying to do is get the GPs trained up to do it, or going back to the hospitals if that's the option with the treating clinician, and just to sort of try and work through. But if you're having any problems, please just let us know and we can try and help with sorting things out. Ipsen still will have a home injection program, but it is more sort of, it will train patients or their carers to do the injections, but if you don't have anybody, then they'll continue to do the injections for you. And they are launching a GAPS program, which is looking at the cost of the PET scan. If it's not subsidised by Medicare or by the hospital, that there is this GAPS program that will help them financially, or if there is unreasonable waiting time for subsidised PET scans, or if there's an unreasonable amount of travel would be required to access subsidised PET scans. So again, just speak to your oncologist, and or if there's any other issues, just let us know. And also there's a generic lanreotide injection coming out on the 1st of August, but there's no home injection program for that. So just so that you know what's out there. And there is a generic octreotide as well, which doesn't have a home injection program either. So we're here to help, and just let us know whatever we can to do to help. And we've got information up the back there of some of the services we've got and how to contact us as well. So I will finish off my presentation, and I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is excuse me, Chady Barkil, who was involved over the last 20 plus years in different areas of pharmaceuticals, manufacturing and development. And Chady is currently the director of MITRU, which is the Molecular Imaging and Therapy Research Unit here, leading a team of scientists focused on introducing and supplying much needed radiopharmaceuticals for South Australian patients in various fields of medicine. So I will now hand over to Chady.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Chady Barkil, and I work in this building. And I will start with a little introduction of the place. Of course, SAHMRI building stands on the land of the Kaurna people, the original custodian of the Adelaide Plains. SAHMRI is not a government institution or a privately owned institution. We are an independent. The board of directors of SAHMRI are from all the 3 big universities of South Australia, Flinders, Uni-SA, and Adelaide University. And all the work we do here is aimed into improving the health of South Australian, and with collaboration nationwide and overseas. We are a part of the Adelaide biomedical cities that have all these fabulous research institutions around us. And as I said, we do collaborations with some of the biggest players in the field worldwide. SAHMRI have currently more than 700 researchers that work here every day. We had more than 20,000 publications in peer-reviewed journals, and we're working on more than 600 projects. And we have different teams working on different things. My talk today is just to explain to you how the research is usually conducted. It's definitely much, much bigger than what I can explain in a few minutes, but just to give a quick idea of how we do the research and what we do actually here. So in general, the research falls into one of these 3 stages: a preclinical research, and then clinical trials, and then we move to supplying the product for hospitals or patients or pharmacies, depending on what is the drug that we're manufacturing. The preclinical trials start with finding a need, finding a disease or a function that we want to see or fix. And then we move into finding a product, which is where the chemistry can come, or the radiochemistry, depending if that is a radioactive product. So that is the combination between the effectiveness of one molecule, of a chemical entity, the biological need, and the imaging or the therapy strategy. Later, we find a target that we can synthesize in a lab. We synthesize it, we test it in vivo and in vitro, we get those data, and then we will be ready to move into clinical trials. An example of a molecular imaging is that we can identify a biological process or a disease. We find the molecular target that we can manufacture, then we manufacture it. It's working. And then we move into the testing on small animals or large animals, depending on the function that we are, or the similarity between those animal models and the human models. And then we move into the clinical trial phase. The clinical trials have different phases in them. The first one is phase 1. Sometimes they talk about phase 0 or other in-between phases, but generally there are 3 big phases. Phase 1 is short in time, and usually it is done for healthy volunteers. So in phase 1, we don't seek to treat patients. And the purpose of this phase is to check the toxicity or the tolerance of that drug. And usually between the molecule that were selected in the first phase, 70% of those molecules pass the phase 1. It means 30% can be found to be not very well tolerated, or they have a lot of side effects, or they just don't work on the human models. Phase 2 is longer in time, and it is done actually on patients. The number of participants between 10 and 50, and the purpose of that is not only to check the side effect or the toxicity or how tolerant it is, but also the effect on the actual disease that we are trying to visualize or treat. And only 33% of what we started with can pass that phase. And phase 3, usually it is the last phase before phase 4, which is the commercialization, is when we have more participants, sometimes in the hundreds. And also we can look at all the interaction with other biological functions, the effectiveness of that, and the difference between different ethnicities or patient groups. And only 25% of the drug that we started with can go past this. And sometimes only 1% in some particular diseases. So when we move to the clinical supply, that's when we should get the approval from the regulatory body. So in America, they have the FDA. In Australia, we have the TGA, but they refer to the same reference in terms of quality and safety of manufacturing the product. Usually they talk about GMP, which is the good manufacturing practices. Now, everything that happened before now was done focused on the chemistry and the efficacy of the drug. From now on, when we go out to the public and we want to send it to the clinics or the hospital, we want to think patient safety. We want to think reproducibility of that manufacture every day by different people, not necessarily the researchers who invented it, with 0 mistakes. So this is where the GMP comes from. That's where the good manufacturing practices is. And because we can't test every single pill or injection, just like when we manufacture matches, the matchbox, and you want to test each and every one of those. We can't do that. Otherwise, we will end up with a very expensive art hobby. So what we do is qualifying the whole system, not just the final product. We don't test the quality in the product. The quality starts with the design of the manufacturing facility itself, validating all the process, training the workers there, and doing a lot of testing that will ensure that the quality will pass every time. And then we test a small sample of that batch, and that will be representative of our initial manufacture. So there are a lot of pillars and a lot of levels of ensuring that quality, but the end goal is the patient safety. All this compliance and all the tons of paperwork that is produced have one goal at the end, is the patient safety. So a quick now application of manufacturing into what happens in this building. So SAHMRI have the only cyclotron in South Australia. That's where we manufacture all the radiopharmaceuticals. So anything that is a short half-life and radioactive is manufactured in this building. It starts with a, let me try if I can do this. We start with a stable isotope, which is not radioactive, that we put in a cyclotron that is 4 level under this stage. And what comes out of the cyclotron on the other end is a radioactive isotope that we send to another synthesis lab. And behind those steel cabinets, we have a 5 centimeter shielding that will protect the worker from the radiation inside. And we label the products that we want to send to the hospitals. And then we dispense them into sterile vial. And before they reach the patients, we have a series of quality control tests, mainly between 10 and 20 different tests that we have to perform, and a lot of paperwork. Now, inside those cells, the chemistry that happens in there is different from the chemistry that researchers are used, that the benchtop chemistry where we mix something, we boil it, we have something at the end. We can do that with radioactive product because that will harm us. So we have robots, which are a synthesis module that will do the reaction for us. Most of them are based on a sterile kit, which is a plastic fluid bath that we install on a machine and it will do the job for us. We did a lot of research down at MITRU, which is the Molecular Imaging and Therapy Research Unit. We published a few of those and we're working on a lot more. Inside that image here, you can see all the different robotic synthesis module that we have. And we are a TGA licensed facility for the manufacture of a lot of products. And a lot of them, or all of them, are distributed here in South Australia, but also we supply all other states. And soon we'll be supplying all the Asia Pacific region, that is between Singapore, Taiwan, all the way to Japan. These are the products that we have in here. Of course, we have a cyclotron that is enough to manufacture some of the isotope, but there are some few of them like the lutetium that we get from ANSTO because it requires a nuclear reactor that we don't have yet in South Australia. This is mainly the thing that we do here. We do a lot of development work and we have the researchers in the building and interstate with our expertise in labeling and working with radioactive products. So we manufacture it for them, we send it for them for testing, but a lot of the work happens here in our animal facility, but also at the large animal facility that we have at Gillis Plains. We have a lot of publications that you can find them online. And this is the type of cassettes that I was talking about that we put on the machines. And if you have questions, I think we will see you at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chady. Our next speaker, I lost you. Oh yeah, Professor Tim Price. And he trained in medical oncology at the Royal Adelaide Hospital and completed a gastrointestinal fellowship at the Royal Marsden Hospital and Institute of Cancer Research, London. He's currently head of clinical oncology research at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, Woodville, and he is also the clinical director of the Bragg Comprehensive Cancer Centre. He is the chair of the current Cancer Council NH&MRC Colorectal Guidelines Committee and a board member of COSA. He's the immediate past chair of the AGITG and GI Cancer Institute 2013 to 2020. And he remains on the board and the scientific advisory committee. So Professor Tim Price is going to talk to us about the Bragg Centre. Thank you.
What do I do now?
Can you exit?
Escape.
That's it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about the Bragg Comprehensive Cancer Centre. I'm hoping that everyone's heard of the Bragg Comprehensive Cancer Centre. It's been in the media a little bit, but not probably quite as much as we would have hoped thus far. And I'll give you a little bit of the history as we go along. So comprehensive cancer centres are not a new thing. They're essentially developed in the US. Nixon actually, with his war on cancer, announced the National Cancer Plan, which included the design of comprehensive cancer centres back in 1971. the model, and it's really, I think, the best way of looking at this is it's a model, a comprehensive cancer centre model, and I'll explain that in a second. But this is now an internationally recognised model to provide cancer care, and it essentially looks at comprehensive and multidisciplinary care, which I guess is the modern way we provide care to patients. Importantly, it integrates both the basic research, which we saw a little bit of, the basic research that goes into providing the medications we then use, the clinical research, and then translating that into our normal day-to-day care. So it covers the whole sort of journey, the whole patient experience through cancer, from prevention until potentially, if it's relevant, palliation. And excellence in cancer care is really one of the key themes behind the Comprehensive Cancer Centre. So in the US, there are now 71 of these centres, and they're often standalone cancer buildings. And I think that's important to just note when I explain what our model here in South Australia will look like. So why do we want a Comprehensive Cancer Centre model? So there is some literature, there is some evidence that having this pathway of care, this very comprehensive way of providing cancer care, improves outcomes. So this is just a couple of papers that show survival. I put the one at the bottom there that says, or found that this sort of model leads to cost-effective care. Now that is important because we think about money and we need money to provide care. The idea here is not to save money, but the idea is to use money more productively so that you can then access new ways of treating patients. So it's a way of getting extra funding, if you like, by using the funding you already have in a productive way. And that is one of the goals of a Comprehensive Cancer Centre model. One of the other key things as a state we need to be aware of is there is the national government wants Australia to have comprehensive cancer centres. We have one currently in Victoria, what's called the VCCC, attached to the Peter MacCallum. That's, I guess, Australia's first CCC or Comprehensive Cancer Centre. And the national government wants us to have a series or a network of CCCs throughout Australia, of which we have the opportunity of building one here. There'll be funding. There was funding last year for a standalone centre in Queensland, a standalone centre in Perth. New South Wales has two sort of comprehensive cancer centres. Chris O'Brien is probably the one that most people will know about from the old RPA TV show. Peter Mac provides care to Tasmania, and then South Australia will develop the Bragg Comprehensive Cancer Centre, which part of that will be placed in the building behind us. The other important aspect of this is that Northern Territory is somewhat left out. There is no funding currently for Northern Territory, so part of our plan, because we work closely with Northern Territory, is that we'll provide a Comprehensive Cancer Centre model through the Centre of Australia, which will include Northern Territory. So currently where we fit is that we have a $77 million grant from the federal government. And I stress that because it's the federal government. There's no state government funding currently, which is a little frustrating. And then we also have a very generous grant from the Hospital Research Foundation, so another $10 million, which essentially is what's feeding the current development of this plan for South Australia. There's no money yet even from the federal government. So this is all based on hospital research funding money thus far. The building there is the building that's next door that's going up, and that's part of the Bragg story. Importantly, underneath that sort of showroom looking area there is the Proton Centre, and that's another part of the enhancing of South Australian cancer care, which I won't touch on. So what does a Comprehensive Cancer Centre look like for South Australia and Northern Territory? So this is the MD Anderson on the right, which is a very large US Comprehensive Cancer Centre, and then the John Hopkins on the left, which is a sort of a collaborative group of buildings, which you could sort of argue North Terrace might be. But this needs to be beyond North Terrace. This is for South Australia. So our model will be an alliance model. So we'll have a hub in the building next door, but we'll need to reach out into all of the other networks. So Flinders, Wellmacuen, rural centres, and then of course Northern Territory. So this will be an alliance model of more of a virtual Comprehensive Cancer Centre, and that's important as we sort of try to develop this model from a South Australian perspective. Now, part of that is also driven by the amount of money. So 77 million is what we've been granted. Queensland, for example, have $760 million. So it's quite different in terms of the funding. So we can't actually build a building, even if we wanted to. So this is what will look like in terms of the building next door. So this is the Bragg Centre. We're going to look at a wellbeing hub. So part of the whole cancer journey is wellbeing, obviously, survivorship, etc. And then we'll take one floor currently, which will house four key themes, which I'll come back to again in a second. But they'll be housed in that floor. There may be capacity to expand over time, depending on our models, but primarily care will still be provided where it is currently. These are our key 6 strategic programs through prevention, data, clinical trials and pathway-driven care, which I'll come back to in a second. Aboriginal health is very important. We know there are a number of gaps and inequalities there. Transformative treatment is a program which is by purpose broad. So theranostics or lutate therapy is, I guess, one of those sort of transformative treatments, as it also translates into prostate and other cancers down the track. And then quality of life and survivorship. So these are our key themes. And the goal of the Bragg Comprehensive Cancer Centre is to help fund these processes, particularly around clinical trials and data and registries, is that we can then drive the quality and care changes that occur out in the other institutions throughout South Australia and Adelaide, and then Northern Territory. Now, I mentioned pathway-driven care there, so that's part of clinical trials. Clinical trials, for most, we would think as part of standard of care. So some of you may have been on a clinical trial. Clinical trials provide a lot of opportunities in terms of new treatments, new ways of therapy, and for most of us, we feel as part of that pathway-driven care, clinical trials should be incorporated in that. So that's why that is one particular program. And I think for the relevance to neuroendocrine tumours, of course, is that the pathway is not straightforward. So one of the goals of the Comprehensive Cancer Centre is to make sure that there is a pathway. We talked about the OCP before, the NET pathway. It's not straightforward. You need a lot of support and services to make that work. So this is a fairly simple pathway. A lot of the time we think, a journey through the health system is quite simple. You get a diagnosis. In this case, you might go and have an operation, all the bits there, theatre, recovery, discharge, and then you go out the other end. But as I'm sure many of you recognise, it's not quite as straightforward for a neuroendocrine patient. This is my rough sort of flow of what sort of key aspects of a neuroendocrine tumour pathway might look like. So obviously diagnosis, we talked about early care before, the screening and so forth. The oncologist may be involved. I'm an oncologist. You may have surgery, endocrinologist. You then have to have the multiple scans, so it's often quite difficult to explain why you need 3 scans, often the gallium, the FDG PET, normal CT. So there are multiple scans. Navigating through that can be quite complex. Getting those bookings, particularly if you're in the rural sites. So that's a really complex sort of part of care. Then you have your therapy. You need to be monitored. You have chromogranin. You don't know whether you're going to have to pay for the chromogranin or not, which we were just talking about before, how much it might be. So you've got to wait to get, someone was telling me before, they get a call on the golf course and get asked to pay the bill. So, it's quite complicated. The urine test, if you happen to require the 24-hour urine, then you go to the MDT, and you might get referred to the NET Centre at Queen Elizabeth for lutate. Then you have all the other aspects of it, psychological support, etc., the cardiac side of it, and then you sort of go back and forward. So it's not a straightforward process. And so the Comprehensive Cancer Centre model is meant to support this by having all of those supports and resources in place to allow, and then I touched on before, the data, the registries, to understand what some of the gaps and so forth are throughout this journey. So we know that the benefits are around those multidisciplinary teams, the nurse navigators or nurse consultants who can guide the patient throughout there. The Hospital Research Foundation I put up there because they fund a lot of support. Neuroendocrine Cancer Australia also support, as you heard before, as nurses, etc. So a lot of this is actually not funded by the system. So again, funding via the Comprehensive Cancer Centre hopefully will enhance and value add to some of these support systems that we need for our patients. And then where does it sit ultimately? So I've alluded to the fact there's a floor in the building next door. Most of this will still exist. So from the net point of view, it will still exist from the lutate point aspect at the Queen Elizabeth. That'll be the Bragg site, if you like, for neuroendocrine tumours. And this is just my rough sort of my view of how it will look in the future. So we've got different hospitals, but I guess if this Bragg Comprehensive Cancer Centre, this virtual model works, we'll have all of our centres sort of as one cohesive integrated cancer service, but existing in collaboration as that sort of diagram is meant to show. And then of course we've got the resources I showed you in the building, the prevention, clinical trials unit, data, and the Aboriginal Cancer Unit, which will be more of a state-based resource to drive some of those services moving forward. And so that's where I think NET potentially fits in the CCC model. Hopefully I've given you some insight in terms of why we're wanting to develop a comprehensive cancer centre. But the next steps are for us to get the federal funding, maybe some state government funding, and then we can sort of expand things from there. But this is very much a state-based process, albeit based within the Bragg building next door. So that's what I wanted to explain. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. Next speaker is Tabitha Healey. 20 years as a medical oncologist and business owner has led Tabitha to a deep understanding of what really matters in life. She's had the opportunity to see the highs of lives well lived and the sadness of regrets. It's clear that the fundamentals of a fulfilling life are strong relationships, good health, and a sense of purpose. She's juggled family, medicine, and running a large private practice. She understands what it feels like to be constantly on and all things to everybody else. So her medical knowledge, compassion, and strong communication skills enable her to bring a unique set of strengths to coaching. As a certified executive leadership and life coach, she has the expertise and experience to guide people to live successful and purposeful lives. So Tabitha is going to talk about community, cancer, and beyond.
I guess the important thing is I don't have a really large building. I could have taken a photo of my office, but that wouldn't have been very exciting. I think the other challenge is it will be very obvious to you very quickly. I'm definitely not the smartest person in the room. There are a lot of people here who are a lot smarter than me. The reason I get a gig is that I was always known as the touchy-feely oncologist, the one whose clinics always ran very, very late because I talked too much. So, Gabby, please give me the time signal when I'm getting to the end of things. And the other issue was that I was sort of the person that was really involved in the human connection and communication, which is why I've been asked to join you tonight. So, as mentioned, I worked for 20 years as a medical oncologist, and then I moved from that into palliative care, and I worked in Mary Potter Hospice for a number of years. And over that time, I built up a practice as an executive coach, and I now work predominantly with doctors and senior nursing staff in terms of helping them to look after themselves in order to be able to look after patients. But the highlight of me working as an oncologist was really about those conversations that you'd have with people when, all the noise just faded away and they were reflecting on what mattered most. And what matters most for people is their relationships and their community. And that was how I came to be invited here tonight, was your community and the understanding that you are a strong group that's deeply connected, but you've also suffered significant losses. And so we're here tonight to discuss what are the issues that you face with a cancer diagnosis, and two of the most significant of those are uncertainty and grief, which are universal emotions, but they are far more significant when you're dealing with cancer. Now, as I thought about this, I thought of a patient who was a man who was in his 50s. He was diagnosed with metastatic bowel cancer, and he talked to me about the fact that he was just cruising through life. There was work, there was family, there were friends, and it was just rolling on, wave after wave, the daily grind of life. And then out of the blue, he was just swept off his feet by this cancer diagnosis, and he described it so eloquently as though my feet were just swept from under me. And then the next minute I sort of arose and I was out of my depth and I couldn't get any traction. I felt like I was sinking underground. And it was that aspect of the uncertainty, the grief, the unknown. And it was that fact that, nobody can really understand when you're diagnosed with cancer. Even if you meet someone who's the same age, the same gender, the same cancer, Their circumstances will be completely different. Their experience will be completely different from yours. And there's the isolation that can occur as well, because you may have to stop working. Some family and friends may pull back from you because they don't know what to say. They're uncomfortable about their own mortality. And then there are those people that have self-inflicted withdrawal. They're so overwhelmed by their anger, their disbelief, or their distress that they withdraw. One of the most powerful examples of that I ever saw was a woman who diagnosed with breast cancer in her early 30s. She had 2 small children. She was a doctor. So she looked at her pathology and she decided, I'm going to die. There's no way I'm getting through this. Despite it was pretty good pathology, she had all the treatment, her doctors reassured her. And so she decided that the kindest thing she could do for her family was to start easing them into her absence. So she just started checking out. So if her young daughters needed anything, she sent them off to speak to Dad. He'll sort you out. Now, I met her 10 years later when she'd been cured, but she realised that she'd checked out prematurely. And her teenage daughters, if they needed anything, they'd go to Dad. And she realised she'd just become an observer in her own life. And it was one of actually the saddest stories I'd ever encountered, because she had this life, but she'd no longer been part of it. And so it's that thing of you have a choice, and do you step out or you just step in, and do you welcome in the community? Do you welcome in those people, your family, your friends, your doctors, your healthcare team and support groups who hold you up and guide you? Now, they don't know everything, but they can at least have some degree of understanding for you and your family. And if we look at medical care, Tim and Chady have done this beautiful job of, it's complex. I'm not a complex person, so I've simplified it to synchronised swimming. And so it's that fact that you need a team. It's highly organised, it's complex. You need to be in synchronicity. And it is that team that is so, so important. They coordinate your treatment, they coordinate your recovery, and they can, to a degree, understand what you're going through. But the issue is, and we know that support groups are so important. We've got Weight Watchers, it's been around forever, highly successful. The absolute cardinal view of support groups is Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. And we know that cancer support groups improve survival and improve outcomes. If you think of communities, we have this room, and then we have 45,000 people dressed in teal, black and white down the road who are a strong community who will all very soon be singing Never Tear Us Apart. So it's that issue with cancer that it's unpredictable. And it's that thing that it's an unpredictable and relentless beast. There's appointments, there's scans, there's blood tests, there's more scans, there's treatments, side effects and symptoms, and all of this just keeps rolling over you. And it's a full-time job for you and your carer, and other things just start to fade away. And with this is an ocean of emotions that wash over you at various times. And the 2 most significant ones are uncertainty and grief. Now, these are universal to all of us at stages in our lives, but they're absolutely critical when it comes to cancer. And so if we look at uncertainty, we don't like uncertainty, and that's an evolutionary factor. It's to keep you safe, because uncertainty means danger. And so it puts you on high alert. It makes you anxious. It interferes with your memory, it interferes with your concentration, and your world starts to contract. And so the issue with this is, with cancer, you never quite know, what's that next scan going to show? What's that next blood test going to be? But what can we do about uncertainty? It's there. So number 1 is to be flexible. You still need to absolutely make plans, but have a fallback position. Don't be absolutely wedded to it, so if it falls apart, that's it. Seek knowledge, because the answer to uncertainty is to find out as much as you can, so ask questions. And if people don't know the answers, ask someone else, or if you don't understand what they're saying, find someone who can put it in terms that you understand. Control what you can and accept what you cannot. It's easy to say that, but it's something that you need to learn to do over time. And the issue is, in cancer, so much can seem out of your control. Things are being done to you, you're being told what to do. But if you stop and think and you break it down into smaller lots, there is always something that you can find that you can control. Now, that might just be your thoughts, it might be your actions or your reactions, or it might be how you look after yourself and how you look after your family. So there's always something there. And then it's letting go of what you cannot control. Sometimes that's delegating trust to other people, to your healthcare team, and trusting in the fact that they know what to do. And sometimes it's just that act of acceptance of saying, I can't change this, I can't control this, I just have to let it go so it does not consume. Mindfulness is a superpower. Everybody should practice it, but anyone with a cancer diagnosis absolutely should. There is endless research that demonstrates that a practice of mindfulness reduces distress. And mindfulness is just about being in the moment, because the past is in the past, you can't control it, you can't change it. And the future is yet to be written, and however much you'd like to, you can't take that back. So it's about being fully present and just living the life in that moment, which will make it richer. It's important to seek support and communicate, and that's part of this group. It's also that aspect of rehearsing the worst. And so many of my patients would always come in and go, right, I've worked through, scans are dreadful, but there is evidence to demonstrate that that is actually really effective. You think through in your mind, play out, what is it going to look and feel like for this to be the worst case scenario? And then you can let it go and re-engage with your life. With a lot of my patients, I was young breast cancer patients, and so a lot were in remission for long periods of time, and survivorship is really challenging. And you spent the whole time worrying about symptoms. Was it something I needed to worry about? Was this the cancer coming back? And so we taught them to compartmentalise. So rather than being uncertain the whole time and being stressed the whole time, allocate moments to it. Allocate a time in the day to think about it, and then switch off. When you're coming up for scans, you can set a date in your diary, which is, I'll start to worry about this 2 days before, rather than for the 6 weeks leading up to it. So put a note in your diary if you need to. Monday, start worrying about scans on Wednesday. Sounds ridiculous, but it's highly effective. In regards to symptoms, for my cancer patients, I'd talk to them about a once-a-week check-in. Rather than constantly scanning and worrying, is this something new? Is this something I need to worry about? Set a date with yourself. Sit down, do a body scan head to toe. Is there anything new here I need to be worried about? Anything I need to deal with? And it stops it bleeding out into every part of your life. And it stops it taking over all of those other aspects of joy. And hope. Hope is absolutely essential, and without it, life is pretty miserable. But hope comes in many forms. It can be simple, it can be complex, it can be immediate or long-term, and it can be small or it can be large. And the beautiful thing about hope is that it doesn't mean that you're unrealistic. It's just that you are hopeful that today will be a good day, or tomorrow may be even better. And the beautiful thing about hope is it's the antidote to uncertainty and grief. And if we look at grief, grief is basically loss. It's letting go of something. Now, cancer, I'm sorry, causes all of the great losses. It takes away your health. It takes away your freedom to choose how you spend your time. It takes away the familiar. It interferes with your plans. It destroys your dreams. It may stop you working, ruin your finances. It shifts your communities. It shows you who your friends truly are. It changes your sense of self. Who am I if this is what I'm dealing with? It can shift your relationships dramatically, take away your independence, and of course, there's the loss and the fear of death. Now, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was the psychiatrist, the queen of grief, and her 1969 book on death and dying talked about the stages of grief, and everyone's heard of these: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. But she got really misrepresented. Someone went out and said that it was the stages of grief and you had to work your way through them neatly, tidily, ending up with acceptance. But in actual fact, grief is just a mess. Grief is this random thing that just can go from one side to the other. You can swing from the highs to the lows. A sound, a smell, a taste, a song can trigger something. An anniversary, a memory, a comment can send you spiralling back down again. And so it is completely unpredictable. And I like this quote, and it fits with my water theme of the evening, which is, it's like an ocean and it comes in waves, it ebbs and flows. Sometimes it's calm, sometimes it's overwhelming. But all you can actually learn to do is swim, because it is part of life. And in cancer, it is absolutely going hand in hand. And there are so many types of grief. It's not simple at all. And just to run you through them, because you may identify some of these for yourself. So there's anticipatory grief, which is the fear of the losses to come. So it's worrying about what lies ahead, and it basically strips you of being present in the here and now. So worrying about death just means that you're not actually able to get on with your day-to-day life. There's ambiguous grief. And this is the fact that it's things that are not recognised or validated by others. And this is really common, particularly in dementia and with chronic disease. I've got a case of a client that I'm coaching at the moment. She's in her early 50s, her husband's mid-50s, and he had a stroke. Now, he recovered physically, but his personality has been completely changed. He's got incredible depression. He cannot move or get out of bed. Now, everybody says to her, oh, thank goodness, you're so lucky you got through that, he's recovered. And he looks fine. But from her perspective, she has lost her husband, she has lost her life, and she's had to give up work and become a full-time carer for a man she no longer recognises. And nobody can see that grief. And it's really common in cancer, particularly if you're in remission, because people go, oh, you finished treatment, you look great. They've moved on. They've gone, good, this is all done with. And they expect you to have done that as well. And you're all living with that uncertainty, that lurking fear of cancer in the background. There's complex grief. So grief normally eases over time. So it will never completely leave you, but it just gets easier. Complex grief stays large and raw and painful, and it does not abate. It causes anxiety, depression, and it stops you being able to function, stops you being able to interact with others, and that requires professional intervention. Then there's collective grief, when you've been together as part of something, and one part of that group is lost if someone dies. If you look at that bus crash in the Hunter Valley this week, of the wedding party where 10 people died on the way home, the collective grief of all of those people at the wedding, the collective grief of that organisation. The collective grief of your group if you lose a member that you care about. Now, the hole that's left is proportional to the size of the impact that that person had. It's proportional to the size of the love that you had for that person. And that's something that's worth celebrating. And the other one that is really important in the cancer setting is secondary loss. So that is that what else do you lose with a cancer diagnosis? An easy comparison is divorce. You lose your partner, but you may lose access to your children. You don't get to have your dog anymore. You lose a social network, perhaps you lose your house. So there's all these other things that come with the initial insult. With cancer, you can lose your work, you can lose your friends, you can lose your independence. And when someone dies, you can lose a network if you're the carer. And one of the most striking examples of this for me was I had a patient who I looked after for 10 years, and she was married to a very crusty old surgeon, and I was absolutely terrified of him. And gradually we became very good friends over time. And after she died, he sent me a letter, and I pulled it out recently. One of the great things about oncology is people used to write a lot of letters. So I have this enormous box at home of letters, and I went through it and I found it, and he wrote to me after his death, and he was saying that he was so lost, but he said that there was so much more that I lost than just my wife. And his words to me were, I miss our appointments. I miss our appointments with you where we talked about so much more than her illness. I miss chatting to the nurses during chemo, the staff in radiology, the woman who took her blood and always made her laugh, and the volunteers who knew how she took her tea. I never thought I would say this, but I miss that life. Now I would see this man in the cafeteria of the hospital having cups of coffee for months afterwards, and he'd just go there because he didn't know where else to go. And he'd sit there having his coffee, and people would recognise him and sit down and chat to him. And then I ran into him at the supermarket a few years later, and he told me he'd gradually recovered. He'd found his friends again, he'd found a new routine, some new hobbies, and gradually that space that had been left by the wife, the community, had just softened. And so I think that one's just a really important one that people don't often recognise. If we look at grief, there's the emotions and the feelings, the sadness, the anger, the raging at the world, physical symptoms, feeling nauseous, a loss of taste, headaches, gut pain. There's the social isolation. When you're grieving, it is exhausting to even contemplate trying to talk to people, to put yourself out there. There's the fog and the confusion. The description is often, it's like trying to think through custard. And then there's the spiritual and existential aspects of it. So for some people with religion, it may be that they lean into it, that this is an act of God, it's his choice. For some people, they may lean out and start to question. I always remember sitting in hospice with a 95-year-old Italian Catholic priest And I made the mistake of saying, you must be intrigued about going to meet your maker. And he said, are you kidding? What if God doesn't exist? What if I've given up my entire life to the Catholic faith and there is no God? So you never know how people are going to react. There's that existential aspect of why me? And I can always remember sitting with a young guy, his name was Terry, married to Caroline. He was 24, diagnosed with metastatic bowel cancer. And he was raging against the world as to why me? I'm fit, I'm strong, I'm healthy, I don't do drugs, I've never smoked, I barely drink, why me? Then he came back a week later and he said, I was thinking about that. And he said, why not me? Why should anybody else have to put up with this? Why should it be me rather than somebody else? And that was his adjustment. So if we look for the negatives, if we look for the distress, that just gets bigger and bigger. But if we look for the joy and the pleasure, we amplify that. And then prioritise well-being. And I guess well-being is my safe space where I spend a lot of my time. Just seeing what my time is. I'll speed up. So you can invite me back and I can speak to you for about an hour to 2 hours on well-being, but I'll cut to the chase here. So the work that I do as a health coach is really looking at holding the space for well-being. And that space is an acronym for me of sleep, pausing, or connect and energy. And these are all things that are free, they're readily available, they're easy to do. And each and every one of them has been shown to reduce stress, improve health and well-being, and drop cortisol. And they're absolutely essential in terms of navigating your way through life in general, but certainly in the cancer space. So there's the importance of sleep, pausing, and this quote from Viktor Frankl, which I always love, that between stimulus and response is space, and in that space is our power to our response, and there lies our growth and our freedom. So it's that you always have a choice. However difficult things may be, you can take a breath, pause, and choose how you respond. There's the beauty of awe, and children just do this beautifully, but they grow out of it. But you look at a child just looks at the world and sees beauty in everything. So how can you reconnect with that? And one of the most powerful things is nature. So I walk every morning up Mount Otton, and this was beautiful moon setting at 5:30 one morning as the moon set over the ocean. So connecting with nature allows you to really get a sense of where you are. Connection and community are absolutely essential. And then energy comes down to exercise. Now, cancer and its treatments make you incredibly tired, but just resting often increases that tiredness. So trying to move, trying to get going, particularly if you take it outdoors with other people, has a huge benefit. And then it's what you eat. So that importance of how you nourish your system. Bottom line is there's no absolute diet, but it should be real, it should be colourful, and there should be variety. And I came across this as well when I was going through my beautiful box of memories. And this was a gift from one of my patients, a young woman that I treated for breast cancer. And she gave this to me and she said, oh, this is a kintsugi bowl, which I'd never heard of. And kintsugi is this beautiful Japanese phenomenon where if the Japanese break a piece of precious porcelain, they don't throw it away. They put those pieces together and they bind them meticulously with golden glue. And in the process of doing that, they create something that is stronger, more functional, more beautiful than it was before. And they revel in its imperfections. And this was the story of her cancer. Her card said, you broke me, you put me back together, and I'm stronger for it. And so it is what we learn about a cancer diagnosis, is that it will break you, it will scar you, it will change you, but you have the opportunity to recreate a life that is more meaningful, that is more colourful for all its imperfections. And it's interesting that Tim had Richard Nixon up there as the founding father of collective cancer centres, comprehensive cancer centres. Because I like this quote that only if you have been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain. And so reflecting on the challenges allows you to see the beauty in life. So thank you for your time this evening.
So I welcome Marni behind me, and she's going to talk about endocrinology in this.
Thank you. Thought that was a lovely talk, Tabitha, and appreciate the cortisol reference from an endocrine point of view. Sorry to have to change tact after that very calming talk, but this will be slightly different. I have been tasked to talk about familial neuroendocrine tumours. And this is probably something that's only going to affect maybe 10 or 15% of people with neuroendocrine tumours. So there's not going to be a large proportion of patients in the audience who will have a familial tumour. So I thought that maybe what more of you have considered or more of you have thought about might be, should I have genetic testing? Why haven't I been offered genetic testing? What is the process of genetic testing? And, what does this cancer mean for my family? So I'm going to talk about familial neuroendocrine tumours, but also with the perspective of genetic testing as well. So all cancer cells are made up of a number of different mutations in the DNA. And there's two different types that I want you to understand. One is mutations that occur in the sperm and the egg. So they're the germ cells. So if you were produced from a sperm and egg that had a mutation in it, that's going to be in every cell of your body. And that's something that you're going to be able to pass on to children. So that is a germline mutation, and that's what can be passed on and can contribute to neuroendocrine, to all types of cancer syndromes. So you almost get a head start and a chance to develop more tumours in different organs and earlier. They're germline tumours that can contribute to familial syndromes. What happens in the majority of cancers, however, is not that they're in the germline. They just occur over time during our lifespan, sporadically in a number of different cells. And so the majority of tumours form this way. They're not something that you can pass down or something that you can inherit, but the tumours form over time just in the cell type, and they're called somatic mutations, and they result in spontaneous sporadic cancers. And so what we're talking about today with familial tumours is really a gene that's passed down through the family that tips the scales to make you more likely to develop mutations. And we can often find a gene that might contribute, and then we can go to other people in your family and find if that gene's affecting you as well, and might change our management in people, and it might be able to help us identify tumours at an earlier stage. This is very different to the concept of what's around at the moment with personalised medicine, tumour genomics, genetic profiling. You might have heard some of these terms if you look a lot into the cancer papers at the moment, but this is almost going the other way. So the mutational landscape of a tumour is looking at the tumour itself and then working out all of those mutations that occurred, mostly somatic mutations along the way, that have occurred to develop that tumour's mutation profile. And the idea down the track might be, and in some other types of cancer already, that might reveal particular mutations that we might be able to target with different types of therapies. But this at the moment is, in terms of the research, is in the preclinical phase. It's not something that we're doing at the moment, but you may hear about tumour genomics, and it is very different to what we're talking about with familial neuroendocrine tumours, which is more the gene being passed down. So familial cancer syndromes are caused by an inherited gene. Family members with the gene have a higher risk of developing tumours. But of course, if you actually have that mutation, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will develop a cancer, depending on what the gene might be. We don't offer genetic testing to everybody because there's a lot of answers we might not know how to interpret. There's a lot of answers we might not know what to do with. But we do offer it if there's a genetic test that we know will tell us with reasonable certainty whether it's causing your problem. We can offer it if the result is going to be interpreted correctly, and if it will influence either your diagnosis or outcome, or if it will provide useful cancer risk assessments for your family. So we don't do it just for fun or for education, because what we want that knowledge to be able to translate into better care for people. Genetic testing, counselling is very important. It's a really tricky process where I think it's very well done in the adult genetics unit in SA Health. They've got a few different sites around the place, and you can certainly be referred to them for a chat. The counselling part is really so that you understand what the outcome of testing might be, what's a positive result, what's a negative result, What does it mean for your family? What does it mean for insurance? What does it mean for, there's actually a consenting process so that you understand that, what if I find non-paternity, or what if I find an answer that I didn't want to know about? So it's a process that involves informed consent, education, and then also interpreting of the test. Someone has to be able to interpret it for you, what it means, and then be able to test your family. And so the genetics unit at the Royal Adelaide and SA Health is very important, and women's and kids as well. And so I'd highly recommend them. So just for a bit more of a clinical slant, thought I'd present some patients. Now these are, don't worry, these are all made up, no one in the room. So first of all, a 56-year-old man, he's got a low-grade mid-gut net, was resected at surgery, but unfortunately later presented with some carcinoid symptoms and was found to have some liver mets. And then we've got a 38-year-old woman who presented, it was an unusual finding of a grade 2 pancreatic net on CT scan for different reasons, so otherwise asymptomatic. And then a 45-year-old man who's presented with quite typical symptoms of adrenaline excess, high blood pressure, sweats, tremor, palpitations, and headache. He was diagnosed with pheochromocytoma, and it was also resected at surgery. For anyone who's not familiar with the term pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma, these are usually adrenaline-secreting tumours of either the adrenal glands or sympathetic or parasympathetic nerves, and quite a particular type of neuroendocrine tumour. So do any of these patients need genetic testing? Are any of these patients likely to have a mutation that was passed down to them and that they can contribute, that can cause a syndrome in themselves or be passed on to their children? So if we look at a number of different neuroendocrine tumours, we can see how many of those mutations are likely to be sporadic or germline. And in fact, small gut, mid-gut, small bowel tumours, neuroendocrine tumours, are almost 100% sporadic. So it's a very, very low chance that you've inherited a gene that has caused you to have a mid-gut neuroendocrine tumour. And so the value of genetic testing is very, very low because we're unlikely to find a gene that we know about that is likely to help you on your journey. The gastric, duodenal and pancreatic tumours, they're a bit more likely to be associated with a germline mutation. So 10 to 20% might be associated with a gene. And so we're starting thinking it might be worthwhile doing some genetic testing now. Pheo and paraganglioma are actually one of the most hereditary or inherited cancers that we have. And up to 40% of cases might be related to a germline mutation that you've inherited. So we're often very keen to do genetic testing in patients with Pheo or paraganglioma. So I won't focus very much on small bowel nets, but the gastroduodenal pancreatic nets and the paraganglioma pheochromocytoma syndromes, just wanted to give you a rundown of the very typical familial syndromes that can be associated with these, particularly MEN1. This is a condition that, as an endocrinologist, that I often will surveil for patients. This is a syndrome where most people actually present with high calcium, hyperparathyroidism. So that's a parathyroid gland that's decided to start overexpressing some hormone, and you get an elevated calcium. The family member might have a history of kidney stones or osteoporosis and high calcium levels, and almost 100% of people with MEN1 have this. They also get pituitary adenomas and the gastric, pancreatic, duodenal nets in more than 50% of patients. You can have a clinical diagnosis if you're diagnosed with 2 or more of those particular tumours, or genetic diagnosis if you're found to have a gene. You can actually, in some of these patients, almost 30%, we might not find the gene that's causing it, but you can still have the diagnosis of MEN1, just if you have the 2 tumours without a genetic diagnosis. Other ones that you might have heard about or come across but are very uncommon, neurofibromatosis, which presents with these, not showing up, leaf nodules in the iris, and capillary lay spots. They're the quite flat freckly plaques or neurofibromas. They can be associated with neuroendocrine tumours and pheochromocytoma. Von Hippel-Lindau also very uncommon. With the paraganglioma pheochromocytomas, the most common one that you might hear about is MEN2, and that's highly associated with medullary thyroid cancer. So we certainly want to know about this one because it's very highly penetrant. So if you inherit the gene, there's almost 100% chance that you might get an early medullary thyroid cancer, and early thyroidectomy, prophylactic thyroidectomy is often indicated in these patients. So you can see how genetic testing might change someone's outcome if we know about a familial tumour. There's also a number of genes that are increasingly being found, which can cause hereditary PPGL. I won't go through them all individually, but initially there was sort of 5 or 6, and we're now up to 15 or 16 germline tumours, germline mutations that can contribute to PPGL syndromes. So if you look at the indications for testing, for doing genetic testing, we really only want to test people where there's a very good chance that we might find something unusual. So you'd be suitable for testing if you've got a family member who has a mutation that's known, if you have a family member who's diagnosed with a clinical diagnosis of a familial syndrome, or really anyone with a familial paraganglioma, because they're so likely to be associated with a germline tumour. Unless you're over 50 with a single simple pheochromocytoma, genetic testing is generally indicated. On these slides, indications for testing, there's no midgut nets because they're such an uncommonly caused by germline mutations. But if you have a gastric, pancreatic, duodenal net, a gastronoma at any age, or a GDP net with high-risk features, so under 40 years old, multifocal, doesn't mean metastatic, but multiple primaries or multiple little focal spots, or a family history of one of those unusual situations of hyperparathyroidism or pituitary adenoma, you really would be a candidate for genetic testing. So if someone came in and wondered whether they should have genetic testing, we might do a three-generation pedigree, looking at your parents, their brothers and sisters, and then the next generation as well, looking for histories of the high calcium levels, other neuroendocrine tumours, paragangliomas, examinations for those typical skin findings, or high-risk features including young age bilateral tumours, or as we can see here, affected patients in multiple generations and across generations as well. So in these three patients, our first gentleman really had no other features or signs of familial cancer and didn't go on to genetic testing. The young woman with the grade 2 pancreatic net, during testing she was also found to have a high calcium, which is likely to be primary hyperparathyroidism, which is suggestive that she might have MEN1. Turns out mother also had some symptoms, so she's been referred to genetic testing. And because our young gentleman had a pheochromocytoma under the age of 50, he's gone off for genetic testing as well with no other family history. So why would we test in these situations? Because knowing the mutation might change the treatment or the prognosis. We might need to monitor these patients for different types of tumours that might arise. Their family members might also carry the mutation and need surveillance for tumours. And it also assists with family planning. So 50% of offspring are likely to be affected, and so there might be some decisions to make around there. So the lady with what we think might be MEN1 syndrome, she went off for genetic testing. And with genetic testing, we don't test the entire genome. We're not going to test every sequence in the body. We can't tell you if you're going to have breast cancer or you're going to have Alzheimer's or you're going to have high cholesterol. We do very targeted testing of the gene that we think is going to cause the problem. So this patient had targeted sequencing of the MEN1 gene and was found to have a pathologic variant. So this means that there's a very, very good chance that he has a mutation that's contributed to these symptoms. The gentleman with the pheochromocytoma, we're not quite sure what gene he might have. So we do a multi-gene panel testing via next generation sequencing of the genes that we think might be contributing. And there's up to sort of 15 or 16 now that might be sequenced in that panel. On this occasion, there was no pathogenic variant identified. That could mean a few things. It could mean this is not a genetic syndrome at all, or it could mean we don't know the gene, haven't worked it out yet, or the technology's not quite there. So if we head back to our patient with MEN1 with the pathological variant, this family is offered variant-specific cascade testing. So identified the mother and identified first-degree relatives who might be at risk, and they are sequenced for that specific gene that was found to be mutated in our first patient. It's good news if you don't carry the gene, because you don't need any more testing, you don't need any more surveillance. However, anyone who does carry the gene is recommended to have surveillance. This is quite intensive. You can see that sort of from age 10 years, you start having annual blood tests for pituitary tumours, for the parathyroid hypercalcemia, and then from age 15, 20, start having 2 to 5 yearly MRIs, looking, basically whole body MRIs, looking for tumours that might arise. So it can be very time intensive, it can be very labour intensive. We don't want to put anyone through surveillance if there's not a very good reason to do it and that we might not find anything early on. But if you do have a mutation, this is really important to stick to and have the screening done so that we can pick up things at an early age. What about the man with a pheochromocytoma? Well, he didn't have a pathologic variant identified, so he couldn't test any of his relatives. But even though he had a full resection, we know that some of these pheochromocytomas can turn out to be malignant years later on. So he should have annual follow-up with his metanephrines lifelong. Just to show you what a screening program might look like if you'd inherited a genetic mutation, for example, SDHB, the one second from the right, they start screening with blood pressures and blood tests from 5 years of age. So it's a very intensive early screening program if you do inherit some of these conditions. But they can be useful to prevent or detect tumours early on. So I just talked to you a few cases of genetic testing where we might use them when they're useful. Most small bowel nets are not associated with germline mutations, but the ones that are associated, genetic testing is very important. The adult genetic unit at SA Health would be your first target, and please stick to the screening programs if it is relevant. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker, I haven't got a very big bio on her, but we've got Associate Professor Gabby Checki, and she's a nuclear medicine physician, but she's also a medical oncologist, and she's a clinical lead for the South Australian PRT service. And I should have said Associate Professor Gabby Checki, AM.
Thanks, Meredith. And so final speaker for the night before Q&A. I just want to say this is my 4th NET forum, 14, 17, 19, and this year. And wow, South Australia and Australia has come a very, very long way. I'd like to think that for patients and carers and healthcare professionals in the audience, and they're going to listen to this, we've got a lot to be grateful for, and I think really exciting, because you always know that there's something there, I think I feel very proud to be working in this area. It's quite a privilege, so thank you for all your patience and everything. I'm just going to hopefully quickly run through this, because I think is 8:30 ending. Is that we're ending? Okay. How to know what to hone in on. So obviously knowing where I was going to be coming in the sequence of the talks. So it's hard to be on North Terrace and be in this health precinct and not be quite overwhelmed by the extremely incredible, iconic buildings that we have around us. But importantly, a building is a building, and it's what we're here for that we have to continuously be reminded of. As Tim alluded to, the new centre, which will be completed and ready to go, will have federal funding for very, very targeted therapy, and we call that proton therapy. And just a shout out to a father and son team, both Nobel laureates, on a Google map not far from here. who were responsible for describing something called a Bragg peak, which is integral to this form of treatment used internationally, and that's why it has the name Bragg. So really important that we honour that, and I think it's really incredible. So there will be very limited tumours that they'll be treating to start with, but as Tim also alluded to, this whole complex and this whole biohealth precinct is so much more than the sum of these buildings. We talk about surgery and chemotherapy and targeted or X-ray therapy as being the pillars of cancer care, and then many new areas want to be the new pillar. We often talk about pillars in healthcare, but certainly theranostics is one of those, and it is definitely hit prime time. So many of you would know and have been around us long enough to know that we will send you off for those innumerable scans. And when we talk about PET imaging, we are really talking about molecular imaging. We are looking at more than just the size of things. We want to try and give an overall profile of what's going on. And we need that as the lead into your therapy. And this is all about precision medicine. Globally, the growth in nuclear medicine equipment and application has just it's ballooned out. We are not a new space. We've been doing this for about 80 years. Well, not me, but it feels it sometimes, in thyroid. And nuclear medicine and the application in that's been around for 30 years. But the game changer and the total disruption has come because of the application for prostate cancer. But I did put this up because I will often get calls from people saying, what about this radionuclide? What about that radionuclide? And we've heard from Chady that there's lots of development going on. But what's ready for prime time? I will continue to reference Neuroendocrine Cancer Australia, who are so much more than even Meredith was able to summarise it. But what they have been instrumental in doing is bringing together those people that need to be in the room to have conversations. And this particular document was about a theranostics roundtable, and there's some really good reading, and a lot of these are all available in the neuroendocrine cancer space. But what I really want you to know and feel positive about is that Australia is really, really well positioned. We've got clinicians that are really connected. There's a lot of pay it forward. We've got really good infrastructure. And at the moment, although we're limited to some types of radionuclide, the hope is that as we can bring some of these new radionuclides to fruition, we can look at different types of treatment. And again, a little bit of light reading, but there's wonderful global alliances, and there are lots of different frameworks and conversations around different aspects of health. The World Health Organization is a really big one, but also something called Lancet Oncology. And a shout out to Professor Andrew Scott, who was one of the leads, and he's a nuclear med physician who was really instrumental in making sure this was not just about medical imaging. A lot of it is about X-rays and CTs, but also that nuclear medicine had a really important role, and this will also then be rolled on to theranostics. So I recently had to present on equity and access for theranostics in Australia. And if you look at us, as a country, we're doing all right. Certainly the eastern states are doing very, very well. And we're very happy that our New Zealand counterparts finally now have PET. Actually, can give radionuclide therapy. The New Zealand patients used to be treated at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre, and currently Tasmania is still treated in Victoria. So they've really, really been very accommodating. But currently we have 6 centres in Australia that can deliver the therapy for patients with neuroendocrine tumour. And I'm very happy to continue to be able to offer this in South Australia. But we are very limited, and we've had several of you be involved with surveys in the past looking at the financial burden, whether it's a blood test or a PET scan you've had to pay for those of you that might have to travel hundreds of kilometres, 200 kilometres to go and get a blood test. We know how challenging that is. So we thought we were going to be successful, and we submitted what we thought were almost erudite submissions for both federal and state funding, and this was released today. And as I said to somebody, I was reading it right up until the moment I had to come and cite all of you that know how hard our team has worked to have additional PET facilities within the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. I will say that it didn't go ahead, but I'm saying that to then say beyond that, as Tim has shown very, very well, is the comprehensive nature of this centre. And I think it's really important. And I do want that as the lead-in, because I don't want anyone here to think that they're not going to have access. And we have access through this extraordinary team that we are. We have, I'm lucky to chair a multidisciplinary meeting or tumour board meeting or MDT or MDM, all of which probably given your permission to. And I heard today that someone was able to access their own MDM summary, which is really important, and it makes me think about the acronyms I use. I better be careful. But the most important thing to highlight is really over the last 14 years, it's been fantastic that this team grows. And you've heard from Marni, who's endocrinologist, and we're really just so in awe of the genetics and pathways. But because of this surveillance, we're getting many more patients coming along, and we have to be really clever about how we monitor them and that we don't cause undue stress, because really sometimes this path, which feels straightforward, can just keep winding, and we have to be mindful that through your journeys that we're able to just offer you the very best. Now, I'm only going to give you one slide of images. These are paired images, and as alluded to before, sometimes we send you off not just for one PET, but for a second PET. And again, shout out to Australia for being really the trailblazers in highlighting that you really do need both. May only need it once in your whole journey, because if you are categorically shown to be low-grade disease and there's no evidence of anything going on the glucose PET, the PET scan that shows higher activity, then we can leave that. If there is activity but they're matched, we get the green light to proceed, and I'm talking obviously about radionuclide therapy. Red light might mean you're not going to go along the path of radionuclide therapy, and you might need to have more traditional systemic therapy. And then there's a very big grey zone of negotiation. And that negotiation happens through tumour board discussions, and obviously there's a hierarchy of treatments. And again, this was a schema that was put together, and often many of you will still be on first-line treatment. Your butt gets very sore after innumerable injections, and we're trying to find somewhere where they can be given carefully. But usually you'll come to us for radionuclide therapy with or without chemotherapy down the track. Now, a timeline. It's an extraordinary timeline, because I think I really wanted to highlight here that it's been some 30 years since radionuclide therapy was first used for neuroendocrine tumours. So that was in 1992, and a shout out to Professor Rod Hicks, who was instrumental in bringing it to Australia early. We were early adopters, and through the 20 years, it took many, many iterations of different sorts of guidelines to establish ultimately evidence for its registration. But we still don't have formal funding pathway for radionuclide therapy for NETs. So we're very lucky that we have just group funding here in Australia, and that's not going to go away. So again, I don't want you to worry about that. But I do want to shout out that Australia were the first international guidelines to introduce radionuclide therapy really early on in the treatment rather than end stage. And that happened in 2008. And we revised them, and are not quite at the point of being on the wiki, on the platform, just for some IT glitches. But I was asked to do a big shout out and remind you all that they're there. And we've already heard about the optimal care pathway. The optimal care pathway is not light reading. So your clinicians are probably not going to want to see the whole bit, but there is a really useful guide. And again, it's something that you can all read and understand, so that you can understand what's needed for your own journey. So that's the Cancer Council guidelines. So when the time comes for us to look at how we can best manage you, as Tim said, South Australia does take care of Central Australia, and this is a postcode dropper for patients that have come to our service. We've even got a few from over the border, because apparently it's easier to come to us than it is to go to the busy Sydney. I've got some nods in the background. Again, since the last meeting in 2019, because of COVID, one might say it is one of the positives of what came out of it was extraordinary telehealth network, which means that some of the patients that we see for the first time may not have to travel hundreds of kilometres to see us, and that's really, really very important. And I didn't want to show too many scans, but for those in the room that have or going through treatment with us, you know that I can't resist showing you pictures, and I want to show you cumulative studies over time, and this is just sort of the 4-hour picture. But what our department has worked really hard on, and she's right here in the room, so I'm going to shout out to Tess Smith. And what we've done is we've tried to look and get a snapshot of your individual profile, and we do that at the beginning, and then we do it at the end. And although they just look like black dots, what we're trying to do here is see if we can make the most of this other information on your scan to actually see if we are optimising your treatment. And I had an extraordinary meeting this morning with an organisation from overseas who are very much at the cutting edge of machine learning and deep learning algorithms, that, terms that we bandy around a lot, but effectively looking at how we can map any individual patient through time and look at how you're responding to treatment, which can then inform how we look at different treatments. And it's quite extraordinary. And what they look at are the total lesions. It's software driven, and we cannot wait to come on board with this. It's here, it's now, it's already got TGA approval, and we have to be careful about how we integrate it into our clinical algorithm. But what it's showing us is that sometimes we can have a large number of the individual tumours responding, and if there's only a small number that are not, but we can identify them, sometimes we can make the decision to just continue doing what we're doing. We might choose additional targeted therapy just for those lesions, and that might be in the form of targeted radiotherapy. Sometimes it could be cutting or dissection. So I'm nearly done because I want the Q&A time. I just wanted to have a shout out to the Australian Teletrial Program, and we've had some fantastic support. I did think she was in the room, but I think she's gone. Pascal in the corner. So Pascal, based in Port Lincoln, South Australia director for this, and something that especially for our regional, rural and remote patients, are going to be really very important. And so thank you for the support there. And also to Matthew and Chad in the room as part of the AusNet. This is really exciting. This is an opportunity for a shared care model, and to the healthcare professionals out there that may only ever see 1 or 2 patients in their whole professional career with neuroendocrine tumour, they really need the support around the lexicon that we know is very, very particular to us. And so looking forward to how that looks. And in the interest of time, I won't go through that. But I couldn't complete this talk without having a huge shout out to both Simone Leiden and Rodney Hicks, who've been instrumental in moving the space of neuroendocrine. Simone Leiden was the original, or her and her brother started what was Unicorn Foundation as a testament to their sister, and that's now in the very capable hands of Meredith and team. And Rod Hicks, who just was instrumental in helping us get started here some 11, 12 years ago. So, we are an incredible community, and we want to make sure that you will understand that we're working towards making sure that that next thing on the horizon, whatever that looks like, is available. So thank you to my team and the hospital research.